Delend, what a dummy! Back to the Fantasy Rugby Draft Podcast. Thanks for downloading and listening. I'm Bruce Wilkinson, and joining me again in the booth is the man primarily made from Moss, Nathan Mossman. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you.
I see you've finally won an Oscar for being tipped over by a beer.
Well, I was probably tipped over by several beers over the weekend, or perhaps knocked down by a few beers, I guess.
I did see a very amusing tweet that said when he was coming up to get his acceptance speech, they should have had the Inception dream music and then spun a top on the desk when he was up there.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, that'd be a good touch.
Yeah, it would have been nice. We're going to go through and review Gameweek 1. There's a heck of a lot of stuff to get through. But I guess the first question I've got, Mossman, what have all of these players have in common? Mike Harris, Damien Delend, George Moala, Samu Karevi, Malachi Fekitoa, Rene Ranger, Stefano Ivalu, Juan Martin Hernandez.
Just something to do with the number of vowels in their name, right?
Close. No, they're all part of Scientology.
Okay, God.
They're also top 8 midfielders that scored less than 8 points this week. An absolute disaster of a week for midfielders. Now, a lot of those, half those guys are injured, but the likes of Karevi and Moala, and even Fekitoa to a certain extent, getting 8 points was the max. It was a terrible weekend for midfielders. I
think it was a crazy week in lots of ways, and that's, I think, just part of that. And it's midfielders. It's pretty scarce at the moment anyway, so it's not like you're going to throw any of those guys out just because of 1 week.
No, exactly, and I think we'll get to the games themselves, but there's some couple of unfancied names there that really are propping up your fantasy team at the moment that we've talked about previously. A little bit of admin. You can follow us on Twitter at Fantasy Rug Draft. That's Fantasy AUG Draft, or drop us a note on support at fantasyrugbydraft.com. A lot of who should I start, who should I sits are coming through later on in the week, which is great, and a couple of people are trying to work some trades already, which is quite good. A bit of a scheduling note. We try to get this podcast out on a Monday night New Zealand time so that it's in time for the South African bunch to listen to the podcast before the Waiver Wire opens. At 9 a.m. in South Africa time it is, but 8 p.m. in New Zealand. So we try and get it out in time for that, but sometimes the worlds collide and it just doesn't really happen. So hopefully you manage to pick this up in time. And also, secondly, in terms of length of podcast, we try to stick to somewhere between half an hour and 45 minutes as a bit of a kind of a marker for our podcast length. But we're feeling as though we just don't do it justice. On Thursday, we felt as though we rushed it a little bit, and looking at the run sheet that we've got for today and how many players we have to discuss and teams we have to get through, it just doesn't look like it's going to be possible to try and shoehorn it into that brief kind of 30 to 45 minute window. So. Let us know if you think it's too much, if there's too long. I don't know how long this is going to go for, but I suspect it'll go into that hour mark. If you feel this is too much, then let us know and we'll try and abbreviate it. But if it's more important just to go through and see if we can pull out some gems and who's not performing, then let us know too. I guess let's crack into it, Mossman. So the Blues Highlanders games, that started off with a hiss and a roar. I guess firstly you were down in Highlanders territory. How did they take the loss?
No, they didn't seem to be crying into their spates too much. I guess it's early on in the season, and it was a decent game, and probably could have gone either way. It
was a pretty hectic game first up. It reminded us all what Super Rugby was about, the end-to-end, the tries, ebbs and flows. It was very good, but I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same. Ben from accounts was exceptional.
Yeah, yep. None of this comes as a big surprise, so yeah.
No, if you'd forgotten how good he was, then, over the last few months, then there's your reminder. 30-odd points for Fantasy Rugby Draft as well. I guess the one blemish, which doesn't really matter for Fantasy Rugby Draft, was getting run over by a rookie, but he'll be hazed for that in the court session, I suspect. Other really standout players, for me anyway, was Bryn Hall and Ehire West. Last year, Bryn Hall had a bit of an injury, and he was in and out of the team with Tana Remanga. I think going into the season, we had quite high raps on Bryn Hall, both from a fantasy perspective and from an actual rugby perspective, and he really looked like he was the missing link on Friday night.
I think the thing about Brent Hawes is, it's going to help Ihaya West. His fantasy value possibly more than he'll provide fantasy value of his own.
Yeah, it looked like Ihaya was a little bit rusty to start with. He missed a couple of kicks that he should have probably made, but he settled into the game quite well, and it's kind of like a little bit like Bill Belichick. You can beat him in the first half, but as soon as he gets information on what the defense is doing and what it's covering up, he can scheme something pretty quickly to figure it out, and second half he'll come over the top. I felt like that's similar to what they did with the Blues, because the Highlanders' rush defense, very similar to a South African defense. They come from outside in, and they try and do that centre kind of blitzing onto the fly half or to the second five. And they did that a lot, the Highlanders, and they were really, really quick up, and that's driven by Fekitoa. But West seemed to figure that out, and that try that they got, that little chip across, was just sublime vision. I think we had a question about Akira Ioane. I know you're probably as similar to me in that if there's a question mark over potentially his injury or how many minutes he'll get, he was put on the bench, but if the Blues were running away with this, then potentially he may not have come off the bench and played at all. But a lot of people were asking whether they should have played him or not, even though he was on the bench. What's your thoughts? I know I'm personally risk averse. I think I know you are too.
Well, not so much really. I think that 30 minutes of Ioane is better than most.
And you were prepared to take that risk that he was going to get 30 minutes, even if the Blues were up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
I was prepared to take that chance. I think that there's loose forward is a little bit thin outside of some of the top guys. The rest of them are either very hit and miss or sort of have a ceiling which is quite low, possibly around the 5 points mark, whereas, he'll chew up 5 points in no time if he gets going.
Yeah, agreed. I guess I just was a little bit worried that he didn't play in the last preseason game and from an injury, and that it looked like, well, I wondered if Tana was just having it as the ace in the pocket if he needed to bring him on. But it wasn't the case, and people who played him, you got those few points, and you weren't disappointed too much, I guess. Another loose forward from the Blues, though, which I suspect will be on a lot of people's free agent acquisition list or on the waiver wire. I suspect potentially even at the top. We'll talk about another guy from the Rebels at the top, but Blake Gibson. Really, really strong game. We've been impressed with him for a while, watching him come through the schoolboy ranks. I think the one thing you would say for me is that he looks like he's that scavenger that the Blues have been missing for a while. Obviously the big point in the game was him running over Ben Smith that everyone seemed to latch onto, and that's pretty impressive. But for me, the most important bit was he actually closed the game out with that turnover on Fekitoa right at the very end that the commentators seemed to miss. And for me, that's when your open side can do that and close a game down on 79 when the Highlanders were doing a full court press is that's what you want your 7 for. What do you make of Blake?
Well, let's be honest. For fantasy, we've probably seen his best game of the year. So I think if you go chasing those points next week, you're probably going to be disappointed.
I agree. Yep, I agree. Tries are very hard to try and replicate. I guess from a fantasy perspective, he got a few more, but you're right. A lot of it did come down to that one run because it was given as a defender beaten and also a try. So. I think he still will be high on waiver wires, and I guess it's a matter of who would you drop for him. Are there any loose forwards before we get into the other games? Are there any loose forwards, or what level would you'd have to be at before you replaced Blake Gibson with someone?
Probably someone just after that kind of Boom Prinsloo kind of area. There's him and there's guys like Matt Todd who are perhaps just on the outer. Mm-hmm. Matt Todd probably a bad example because he didn't play. But,
Jordan Tafua.
Yeah, possibly in that region. Obviously, he's still going for Tafua. But I think there's a tier just down from there, possibly.
Kane?
Guys like Arno Botha. No, I'd still take Kane. But the Arno Botha type player who sort of sounds okay. Like you think he'll do all right, but doesn't really put up massive points.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. All right, moving on to more fantasy relevant players. Vicinere had a strong game for you. I think it'll be interesting to see how long he is persisted with at fullback because he made a couple of pretty strange decisions on defence. The obvious one was was running out of the line for Ben Smith's second. For Naholo's first, when he just sprinted out of position at fullback and allowed that chip kick for Naholo's try. But Ben Smith's was equally as shocking when he ran out of the line, and I believe that's been a knock on his for a while. So, but whether he plays at fullback or wing, it looks like he's going to produce points for you.
Yep.
He got injured, so did Naholo. At the very end, I didn't see much more of it, and I haven't heard much more of it since. It's a bit of a shame Liam Squire getting knocked out. He looked really, really good first up, and he looked like the player that we hoped he would be for fantasy as well. Much more from this game that you want to pull out from a fantasy perspective?
Just the fact that from where I was watching, the Highlanders didn't seem to go wide too often, just from phase play. I mean, it obviously didn't affect Ben Smith, but it did seem to affect the others. I mean, Naholo got the try, but other than that, I thought him and Osborne really weren't in the game very much at all.
No, they weren't, and Osborne didn't do you any favours with a yellow card as well, which is a bit of a shocker.
No, he did you a favour if you're playing against him.
That's true. There's a 50-50 chance. So one player we haven't mentioned yet is Tay Walden. Scored the try, so again, probably going to if you're chasing fantasy points, it's probably not the smartest, but I have put a claim in for him because he played okay. I thought he played pretty well, and he could well be that 12 ahead of Rob Thompson and Emery and Treby for the Highlanders, and I think that's valuable enough to try and put a claim in. Now, I'll frame that a little bit. So I put a claim in for him ahead of Jan Serfontein. And I was cutting Jan Serfontein, and my starters were Moala and someone else who was in the top 5. Who do you think? Is that a decent level, or will you still take Serfontein at that point? It's a bit of a roll of the dice.
It's very much a roll of the dice, and he's probably not that different from Treby in some ways.
Sure.
You know, he's not electrifying, you'd have to say. He'd look more solid than anything else.
I wouldn't want him as one of my starters, as my starting midfielders, but I rostered him because I have 2 starting midfielders, and I felt as though I had Jan Serfontein on the bench, and I was like, you know what, if I pick him up for a couple of weeks, let's see what happens, and then go away from that.
Sure.
All right, Brumbies Hurricanes. I guess firstly, the game itself, goodness gracious. The Brumbies look like a very organised unit, very, very organised, and they just blew the Hurricanes off the park. And it was mainly around the scrum and line out, but what I found a little bit strange was that the Hurricanes' first scrum actually crushed the Brumbies. And then the Brumbies, for the next, I don't know how many minutes, the next rest of the game, they turned it round. Just from a rugby perspective, did you see that coming?
The result, you mean?
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
I don't think so. Especially given that the Hurricanes had a reasonably handy pre-season, well, at least the week before. So, no, but I think in the Brumbies we're looking at one of the top teams in the competition.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be surprised if they weren't the top team coming out of Australia, at least. I guess folks in New South Wales will be jumping up and down at the moment, but that's a pretty well gelled unit. And looking at the impact that those guys came off the bench as well, with Man Ray and Smith and all those guys, it was very, very impressive. It was quite frenetic, the pace I found, and they were just linking up a lot. It was like the Brumbies with all these sweeping back lines, you know. It was really, really good. From a fantasy perspective, I guess 2 things. First of all, it turns out we're pronouncing Aiden Toa wrong, which I hope you're all sitting down. It's a bit of a shock to all. But according to Greg Clark, it's Aiden Toa. The U's silent in Australia. He just looked terrible. He just looked very apprehensive. He just didn't look that confident. Every time he chimed into a back line, which was seldom, he just flicked the ball on. And he had that kind of cunning knack to run to the side that the ball was never passed to from the halfback. I've seen players do that before, and it's when they have a lack of confidence and they just don't really feel as though they want to be in the game. And as well, he looked as though after every tackle or every collision or every ruck or more, that he could potentially be out for 10 weeks every time. He was down and he was limping, he was knocked down. He made a covering tackle where he got in the way at some point, but I guess we have to hold out. Well, I have to hold my hand up certainly and just apologise for that kind of little gem. I thought in a 50-point loss that it would be very difficult to pick up 0 points or actually -1 point. So it takes some talent to do that.
But I mean, I guess to cut straight to the heart of it, what does that mean for fantasy? You saying he's droppable? Would you get rid of him?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I don't knee jerk, but I'm knee jerking. It's Robbie Coleman's job when he gets back, and people have been some helpful folks on Twitter have been discussing Aiden Toa with me, and I've just said, look, it's Robbie's all the way back, and they're suggesting to pump the brakes. It's the first time back. He may get his feet under the table. This will be good for him and get a bit of confidence, but I don't know, it's a short season in 14 weeks in fantasy rugby draft, and Aiden Toa, who I thought had quite significant upside, I think you can do better as your third outside back. Each game week, I think you can pick up another guy, and certainly if you've got Robbie Coleman, he'll come back into the team when he does.
Good to see you nailing your colours to the mast. We like that.
I try. And on the New Zealand flag, so Phil Kearns made a really interesting point, which is something I haven't mentioned or said on a podcast or ever in a pub. But he made an interesting point around Lea Leofano's kicking, in that you remember how he used to have a really big dog hook, Lea Leofano, and he'd turn the corner and the ball would, a little bit like Jonathan Thurston, a real big hook.
Yeah.
He didn't have that. He didn't have that hook this time, and I wonder if he's been doing some work in the off season. But his metronome kicking, his field position as well, and the way he ran that back line was really, really good.
Yeah, speaking of Phil Kearns, though, I think he's obviously just started doing CrossFit or something, because he seems obsessed with body shape. He went on and on about how the Brumbies were in such good shape and how they looked lean, and then sort of said the opposite to the Hurricanes. Was pretty critical of Savia and talked about the size of his shorts. So, Kearnsy very interested in male bodies for some reason.
Yeah, I did hear those comments around Phil Kearns and calling Savia fat. I thought it was a bit harsh. There was an article written in I think it might have been the stuff in New Zealand around Phil Kearns' comments, but the best response to that is, and there was also, so they talked about how the pre-season with the Hurricanes TV program was a bit of a distraction, and how, the kind of Hard Knocks curse, which is, Hard Knocks, for those who don't know, is the NFL's version of following a pre-season team, and invariably the pre-season, the team that they follow just tanks or has a terrible season. So Phil Kearns was trying to overlay that kind of type of analysis and calling Savia fat. And someone in the comments section, Bob the Baker, said, to be fair, there is a link between the starring in a reality TV series and being fat. Just look at the Kardashians. So that's pretty good. Beauden Barrett, he should have made a couple of kicks that he missed, but aside from that, you're not really too worried. There's literally nothing you can do, right? You're not cutting him. You're probably not going to get anything in a trade for him, and it's just one bad week, right?
No, of course, and it happens.
Yeah, indeed. Kubili's try was well done, well taken, well moved, but I think the most important part was that the scrum was crushing the Hurricanes. It wheeled and gave Kubili the time to be able to get around there. I think we made mention of the Brumbies front row being a good pickup and being one of the, if you didn't get the Jaguars and Hurricanes, is picking them up late in a lot of your drafts. And we talked about the change in philosophy and this change in maul law that, Jesus, I tell you what, if you watched the games in the weekend, no one seemed to be able to understand it, and the commentators had a really difficult time trying to A, identify it, and B, explain it. But the Brumbies, they didn't do the traditional pocock at the back. The one time they did do it was with Moore at the back. And I'll get on to the next game, Cheetahs Jags, because the commentators there were excellent, and they pulled out, just as I was identifying it as well, they pulled out exactly what seemed to be happening, which was a lot of the defences were working on last season's rules and laws and committing a lot of bodies to those mauls, and it made it really easy to perform moves off the back of the maul, and really intricate ones. Oh, sorry, not even really intricate ones, just a couple of 3 passes and a bit of version, because a lot of those players were committed to the maul. And we saw that a few times, and we saw it in the Brumbies as well, where they had that quick line, well, not the quick line out, but the one that went back, that I think it was Pocock that did eventually score it, but it certainly wasn't from a training maul. So it's just one to identify there. The Brumbies front row actually scored, I think it was our highest of the week, to be honest, but either way, it certainly was a shift in their philosophy from just having the ripper fall to the back of the maul from David Pocock. Did you get that sense as well?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a couple of times over the weekend where I noticed it. So what would happen is it would come down from the line out, perhaps even to Pocock. But of course, he's not in that position to form the maul at that point. So Stephen Moore would actually come around from hooker and join late.
That's right.
And then they'd siphon the ball back. So in the end, it was actually, he was better positioned to come in and take the ball at the back just because he wasn't actually involved in the line-out.
Yeah, and I wonder, if you look at the points this week and you look at what front row scored, you can't help but think there's a little bit of a trend there. There's a lot of high-scoring front rows this week, and I wonder if it's a lot to do with, or has something to do with these flankers or loose forwards aren't necessarily the rippers anymore. And it is the hooker that comes in because he's the last man that joins them all. I saw it get pulled up only once. I think it was the Sharks-Kings game where the Beast, I believe, packed down in front of Coetzee, and so they scrubbed Coetzee's try off. Quite rightfully so it was. He came in and just packed down in front of him, and he was swimming to the back. But that was the only time I saw it pulled up. We'll get to the Crusaders Chiefs games where Nisbo and Marshall had a little bit of trouble identifying. But anything else from the Brumbies game?
No, just Greg Clark just seemed on a mission to fit as many stats into the game as he possibly could. I don't know if you noticed that.
I didn't actually notice that, no. Did you really?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He was just dropping them all over the place. He's got some good researchers there.
Nice. I guess Milner Scudder's match-up proof?
Oh, of course, and I don't think, we don't even need to talk about him.
No, that's right. What about Lamapi in midfield? I mean, I guess he scored that long-range try. You can't really draw too much from this game from a Hurricanes perspective, can you? I mean, TJ Perenara was nippy all day. I think he had a couple of points actually, that they were standing and they were taking out players behind the ball and they were sealing, and it just wasn't refereeing in a fair, equitable way, I guess is probably the way you describe it. But any players that you really want to say, okay, now I'm avoiding on one performance? No,
not at all. No, I think just on Lamape and the Hurricanes front row, I think they were just a little bit too predictable. It was just crash ball, it seemed, all day.
All right, excellent. Okay, let's move on to the Cheetahs-Jags game. It followed the pattern that we thought pre-season, and the Cheetahs decided not to tackle. Astonishing tackle count missed from the Cheetahs, and as a general, I guess, pattern analysis, the Jags are going to score you a lot of fantasy points. Not necessarily that this is a bit of a rusty run out, but there's a lot of players in this team that score a lot of fantasy points for not necessarily translating to doing nothing. So, for instance, Cordero was the top defenders beaten, but he probably only covered like 10 metres. The guy steps like 15 times in a 5-second period, and he just beats the same player backwards and forwards, and that seems to tally up the defenders beaten. So I think he's going to have a very, very high floor this year for fantasy points because he just looked electrifying. I guess from Tuchelet looked really, really sharp at fullback, so folks who took a little bit of a punt from him, I think you can do that going forward as well. How much of this game did you catch?
That would be 0.
0, okay, cool. Yeah, it was one player we talked about as well was Francois Venter. He looked dangerous every time he got the ball. Now he's a really unfancied name, right? But he'll be a quality fantasy rugby draft player for you all season. He's got such good value. He always puts out points, and he's just a player that you we talked at the top of the hour about having your top 8 midfielders who have big upside, but they perform nothing for you this game. Venter doesn't do that. He just applies his trade. As I say, he's a really unfancied name, and you're probably not going to be able to trade him because he doesn't have that name. But just put him in your starting lineup and just watch the points come in. He was the top scoring midfielder this week, and he just looked really good. Now, a lot of that I will put a little asterisk and say that he ran the length of the field with an intercept try and scored it, so he's probably not going to, as you say, repeat that up into the 30s again. But he'll still put you, again, we talked about a high floor, or indeed a high floor, and he's got that as well. The Jaguars obviously have a little bit of work to do on their discipline. They were down to 13 at one point, and that's where the Cheetahs did a lot of their damage. They were quite clever in the way that they did that. And I'm not really sure how Lavanini didn't get a red card for that kneeing in William Smith-Small's back. The referee, and you've seen this before, right, where the referee said, well, he didn't actually connect, so it's not a red card. It's like, well, he dived at him, and he dived at his knees, dived with his knees at the guy's rib cage, and he did actually connect, so he was wrong in that count. But for me, the intention should be enough. It should be a red. Zellinger missed a lot of points to start with, but he settled into it, and he was actually a really, really, really good fantasy rugby draft player. I'm not sure it's too repeatable, but that Cheetahs game is going to be helter-skelter a lot of time. They're committed to attacking, and there's not many tackle bags at training, I would have thought.
Well, I guess possibly one of the least surprising things of the weekend was a high-scoring shootout in Bloemfontein. I think we'll probably see a few of these over the season. Like I said, I didn't see the game, but I guess the things that people are going to be looking at this and they're going to be asking those questions is Zellinger like someone that you need to look at? Is he worth a pickup, I guess?
For people who had the likes of Tusi PC and I don't know, maybe people had Jack McIntyre, Jack Debrashini, yes. That kind of, and Brummer, yes. People who have Dupree, Jono Lance, no. I would still have Jono Lance and Dupree over Zellinger.
Okay.
But if you have that kind of fourth tier and you are really scratching around, and I know one of the guys in our league last year, he's got Zellinger and he carried him a long way into scoring really, really well. But I still would have Lance and Dupree over him, and we'll get to both of those. Sanchez, some touches of class. He bossed that game around the field in the second half once they got their full complement back. But not really necessarily fantasy point of view, but I've always been pretty critical of the South African commentary. Actually, I've been pretty critical of most commentaries, but the guys who are doing the Cheetahs Jags games, and I couldn't pick up who it was, so apologies out there to South African listeners, but they were very, very good. They had some really good analysis. They picked up the maul change and the effect that it had on it straight away, and they actually provided with some really, really good sound bites on there. And the last little bit I have here, I want to see if anyone else picked this up, but there was a bit of a dust-up at about 70 minutes, and it was a bit of a bench clear, and there was a bit of handbags. There wasn't a hell of a lot going on, but at one point there was a boxing bell that went over the tannoy. It was a ding-ding, seconds out type one. And I think it was just to say, just to kind of to get in the heads of all the players to think, oh, it's a bell, I have to stop, put my gloves down type thing. It was one of the strangest things and one of the funniest things I've heard in a long time. And I wanted to see if any other listeners had heard that, or any other Cheetahs supporters, if this is a common occurrence to have this bell when any fight rings out or breaks out, or how it actually works. But that was quite amusing. Are you going to pull much from that in terms of players that you should start, bench, pick up? I guess Zellinger is probably the big one in that game.
Yeah, I mean, and looking at it just purely from a points point of view, which is all I can do, having not seen this particular game. I mean, Raymond Rule, he was right up there this week. Is that someone that some people should be interested in?
Yep, that's a great call. Raymond Rule is only owned in 50% of leagues, and he was actually only started in less than 5% of leagues. So I think he's a good option to put a waiver in. As I said, the Cheetahs are going to play this game. They're going to be behind by a lot. I think he once was a bit of a golden boy in fantasy rugby draft, and I guess you look at his points output, and I suspect I'd put a waiver claim in for him. I guess Aiden Toa is the one that I would drop that we've previously talked about. I'd still probably have someone like Tushilet over him, but if you look at and we'll get onto a little bit of this at the very end of the podcast, but if you look at players to pick up, we usually work on that kind of 65% owned and less. Anything over that, we don't really think that player will be available in your league. So at 57%, Raymond Rule, I think he could possibly be available in your league, so I think that's not a bad shout.
So Raymond Rule or Corey Jane?
I've been a bit critical of Corey Jane. I'd probably go Raymond Rule.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
How say you?
Yeah, I think there's probably something to that. Corey Jane, I almost get the feeling he's not capable of putting in the big game these days. You know,
Yeah,
I don't think
agree.
he's got a 30 point game in him anymore.
And if you'd watched the preseason with the Hurricanes, all his wife is hoping for is that he goes injury free. So
Yeah.
I suspect that at some point that hamstring will play up on Corey Jane, and you have to factor that in because he's got priors for that. So that's probably why I just go Raymond Rule. But that's a good. You've grabbed a good comparison there. That's probably about the level.
And I mean, just in terms of comparison, I'd imagine Corey Jane's ownership percentage is going to be pretty high.
Oh, it's huge. I just looked it up then. It was somewhere in the 97, 98%. Yeah, 99.7%.
Right, there you go. So, I mean, there's a classic example, really, perhaps people trading on the name a little bit. Absolutely. And that's where managers at this early part of the season who are perhaps a little bit more onto it could pick themselves up a bargain at the expense of others who probably aren't on the ball quite as much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we're recommending that you cut Corey Jane, blindly. You need to be smart. You need to figure out who that player is that comes in, and we're just saying Raymond Rule's probably a good decision.
So, Sunwolves Lions up next, another game that I did not catch. I assume you did?
Yeah, we did. It was the first of my quadruple header on a Saturday. So I got the lawns done and I got everything else, fed the dog, walked the dog, got everything under the belt before the 5 o'clock New Zealand kickoff, and right. It was great.
So the Sunwolves, are they the worst team to ever step on a rugby field, as we were told they were going to be pre-season, or is there actually some fantasy goodness there somewhere?
No, they're not the worst team. And first of all, are they the worst team? No, they're not. They played with heart. They played with a lot of passion. They played like watching a game of sevens. It was frenetic. It was just like everything you'd expect from to really be. It was a quintessential Japanese performance, if you will. It was just they were crazy at the breakdown. Everything was just so fast and executed at pace. But they had a lot of passion. They played really well, and that crowd carried them over as well. So they had a really big crowd there of about 25,000-30,000 people, and they're all howling like sunwolves. I believe that's their catch cry now. And if you've seen their mascot, which is quite frankly terrifying, you'll know that there's a hell of a lot of support, and it carried them that first game. Now, how that translates into fantasy rugby draft goodness, there weren't too many players from the Sunwolves that I'd actually have on my roster still. I think the Kings are in worse shape than the Sunwolves, though, looking at them. I guess one player you'd stick with is Tusi. He actually played really well. He marshalled them around the paddock quite well. And actually accrued quite a few points, but he got a yellow card in there, which kind of dented his performance. Otherwise, I think he would have put up around about 15 points. I think it would have been. And
did you see any Japanese-style signs in the crowd? Anyone, with a banner that said "Sunwolves happy, enjoy," or just some random thing?
I didn't, because I don't understand Japanese, but I did see a lot of SARS masks, which I'm going to have to get myself one.
Nice.
So. The howling with the the SARS mask coupled with the Sunwolves.
Okay, so PC has some value, as
he does.
Saying, yep.
And I guess one of the questions, so there was a bit of criticism around TCPC's binning, but the team was on a warning. He didn't join from the hindmost feet. He picked it out of the side of the ruck, and the ref had no option. A bit of a shame, but he blew up. The crowd blew up, but I believe it was actually the right call.
Okay, and Sunwolves front row, fourth highest scoring front row this week. You buying that?
No.
No.
Look, you get a lot of points out of Shotahori. He always been a pretty good player to run with the ball, but they scored a try there, and the Lions made a lot of mistakes. They had a lot of mistakes in classically what they call the red zone. Otherwise, certainly in the first half, and they would have been up by a lot more. But there's a lot of penalties given away in dangerous spots and a lot of knock-ons. But I was actually going to say, we've done this previously where, you start any front row playing against X. Mm-hmm. I think previously it's been teams like the Rebels in the first year, I think, and last year was, I can't actually remember. I don't think there was actually one, maybe the Force, but they were pretty good as well. But this year I think the front row to start against is the Sunwolves. their lines, scrumming and mauling, were really, really good. Now, I think obviously the Sunwolves have only had a couple of weeks in camp, so potentially they'll get that technique sorted. But for now, I think you can safely start anyone who's playing against the Sunwolves, or the front row starting against the Sunwolves, and maybe roster that as well.
Right, so there might be a streaming option is what we're saying here.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe that was just because Malcolm Marks was really good coming on, and also was Dylan Smith. I mean, these guys were really, really impressive. They were running like centres to set up Marpo's try. Dylan Smith was just really, really impressive. And we know Malcolm Marks was a bit of a beast last year, and it looks like he's going to push on as well this year.
Okay. And so from the Sunwolves, any other players that perhaps you're interested in?
Duratulo played well. Duratalo, I believe it actually is. He had really good work rate, and he carried the ball, and he came into his own in the second half, and he was one of the players that carried that Sunwolves team back into contention. So I think he's probably a decent player. You talked about your Arno Bothary and your Blake Gibson. He's probably down that kind of area. I'll probably still have Blake Gibson, and well, maybe I would have Duratalo over him. But apart from that, that's probably all I'd look at.
Okay.
Viljoen was good, and he took a long-range kick as well. So TCPC looks like he's got a range inside that kind of 40 metre zone. And
PC was on the field at the time?
He was, he was on the field at the time, and Viljoen took a long-range kick, but it was a terrible contact, and he just thudded it and didn't look good. But he did look good before that, I would have, and I did make a note to say that, potentially he's someone to look at, but I wouldn't necessarily roster him now. Obviously, I'll drop Aiden Toa for him. Jesus, this is going to look pretty bad, isn't it, if Aiden Toa turns out to be a Wallaby in place? Scores 25 points a game next.
Oh, yeah. So I guess the only other player from the Sunwolves that I just thought was possibly interesting moving forward is Luaki Moli. And basically because he is listed as a lock in the game, but I believe was playing flanker. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure of the position he was playing, but he certainly was all over the paddock.
Yeah, and I think he was the number 6 on his back anyway. And there's a few locks out there, which I'm sure we'll cover, Jed Holloway and Jonas Kirsten, who are in that similar position, that they're playing in the loose forwards listed as a lock. And if you don't own one of the top locks, then they're probably not a bad option.
100%, absolutely.
Yep. So just moving on to the Lions. So Elton Yankees, a player that we'd kind of advocated as part of the draft strategy, to wait on. We've already talked about maybe a couple of them, Lelia Fano and Ihia West, and so far so good on those guys. What did you think of Yankees? Is that strategy going to hold for him too?
The short answer is yes. I think he left a lot of points on the board. His first kick at goal was potentially, I've ranked it in my top 3 worst kicks ever at any level. A schoolboy through under 13s through internationals. He was not far from in front, and he put it into, I don't know what happened. I can't even figure out what happened. He missed his second one as well. So he left a lot of points on the board, but ultimately, yes, you are going to get a lot of value out of grabbing Elton Yankees in that 3rd or 4th round. I think he scored pretty well as it was, somewhere in the 15 to 20 point range, but yes, Elton Yankees would be good. He sets a good back line. Harold Vorster came back. Mapo looked good. Combrink was the one player I was a little bit disappointed with. I think a lot of people were putting him in their lineup expecting significant output just based on the Sunwolves matchup, and I wouldn't wait a decision on whether they play the Sunwolves just at this stage. They look fairly committed, and they look like they're going to. They look like putting everything to the cause, and they tackle well, and it looks like they're probably not going to give up a lot of points like the Kings have been doing, or like the Kings against the Sharks.
So I'm wondering myself, and people have actually been asking me, how does Jaco Creel score all these points? Because people kind of look at him and he seems sort of an unlikely candidate for it. And having not seen too much of him live, and I know other people are in the same boat, they're just saying, how's he doing this?
I guess looking at this game in particular, he scoring a try and making a break on the end of a try helps. But in general, what his kind of pattern of play appears to be is sitting in that kind of Kieran Reid channel. He does that quite a lot, and he sits out in that area where the centre might be running with him. But he just pops up. He just seems to have a knack of popping up in the right place, or when a ruck is breaking down and he's just on the pillars. There's no pillars there, and he just charges through that area. But for the most part, it's ball carrying and the way that he beats defenders, and he's just got that little bit of pace. Warren Whiteley was really good in this game as well. Similar breaks. He's a bit more of an industrial runner, shall we say. Yako Creel seems a bit more of an athlete and natural running with the ball. So I think people who started Yako Creel can only just be stoked with what they saw. It looks like it's just picking up from where last season was left off.
Okay. Anything more from this game?
The only thing I would say was that who gets to organise who sits where in the commentary, it's not in the commentary box, in the coach's box, because they set the cameras up, and I'm pretty sure that they set the cameras up because they want to get a shot of the coach and his reactions to penalties and tries and that type of thing, but they had them mixed around, so Johan Ackerman was in the background and very rarely see him because someone was in front. But more importantly, you could hardly see Mark Hamill because Philo Tete has a massive melon, and he was right in front of the camera, and you couldn't see Mark Hamill or Nathan Major at any point in time because Philo's melon there. So I think that's one thing the Sunwolves can work on is getting their coach's box and putting names on chairs.
You don't think that was part of TSE's job description? Needs to sit there and block coach with massive head.
Well, they did interview Zinzan for it as well, so I think Philo just got it oversized.
Yeah, I think Owen Finnegan made the shortlist.
No, that's probably about all I'd have to say. I mean, Sawasa, the halfback for the Sunwolves, played well, but it didn't really translate into fantasy rapid draft points.
So, Chiefs Crusaders. Good defeats evil once again.
Indeed. I felt this was a pretty tight game for most of the game. I think the one thing there's two points to make. The X factor got over the line. Damien McKenzie effectively was the difference between the two teams. I think there's a small element of Reed Prinslip being injured for the last 5-10 minutes. He got knocked out quite significantly, and the fact that the Crusaders couldn't bring a loose forward off the bench, and we had to play a third string halfback in the position. And you saw it in that last line out maul from the Chiefs, that we just didn't have any power in there. So I say the Satyrs didn't have any power in there. So I think coupled with those two, it probably was quite deserving that the Chiefs did actually win.
So fantasy, I guess the burning question, the things that probably most people will be the most interested in, DMAC taking the goals. Cruden not. Anything to this? So
the first one he took was from range, and I kind of jotted that down to sure Cruden's coming back from a significant knee injury, so that's probably why they've got him doing the strenuous kicking, if you will. But then he also took the next one right out in front. So I don't really know what to make of it apart from he did this last season.
Yeah,
so
we've seen this before, right?
Exactly right. He scored 40 points last year in a similar situation. You know, he was coming in, Cruden was coming back from injury, and I think Dave Rennie he's quite wise with his management of his players and his injuries and stuff like that. So I think if you're banking on DMAC and if you're trading for DMAC to be that kicker for the rest of the season and to put this output out, you'll be a little bit disappointed. But it's hard to ignore just how good he was, regardless of goal kicking. He this year he'll be an All Black. It's a matter of time, and it's going to be really interesting to have someone at fullback again who isn't just, is a bit similar to Ben Smithy and Milner Scudder, not really size, but just can beat a man. And we talked about Cordero stepping and beating 4 people in a 2-metre spot. Damien McKenzie does the same thing. He's just so electrifying to watch. But for fantasy, I think those who actually drafted him in the 3rd or 4th, or if you drafted early, you potentially got him in the 6th or 7th round. I think he's going to be wonderful for this year. And to be honest, I don't really care if he's kicking or not. He's going to be in my top 3 outside backs every week if he's starting.
I guess there weren't too many standout performances in this game. It was probably one of the rare ones that didn't put up massive points. But Richie Mo'unga, pat on the back for you?
Yeah, I guess one of the reasons I did okay this week in a few of my teams is because of Richie Mo'unga. It's one game. Let's see how it gets on. But I really do, what I've seen of Mo'unga in the past translated to this game as well. He sets a really good back line. I like the way that he it's kind of a bit like the Waratahs game where there's really flat passing on the line. He puts the defence under a lot of pressure to guess which tackler, which ball runner that the ball is actually going to go to. It does put a lot of stress on the Crusader ball carriers as well, but it works well. And he took his try. Okay, it was from a scrum that the Crusaders did really well in, but he still had to dummy and be confident enough to take it. But no, really, really good things from Mwanga. Decent kicking as well. And back to DMAC. One question I did have, and one knock I have on him, is that smile is really creepy. Have you got any idea, being a Chiefs supporter, what that smile is about that he does when he's lining up to kick goals?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I know at one point Nisbo said, he's clearly enjoying his work out there. And like you, I was thinking, no, it's actually a little bit creepy. But no, it's quite funny. I don't know if it's a reaction to getting booed.
No, I don't think it is. I think it's part of his routine. I think someone's told him this is to get relaxed, is tell a small joke, or to think of something funny, or think of the same thing, or force yourself to smile, or something that's part of his routine.
It's just a trigger movement. Or
it's just exactly. It's it's like we're sitting on the first golf tee about to shank it into the car park. It's that type of thing. You get your systems in place, and it's part of his process. I guess we'll see when he plays at home.
Yeah.
But any other suggestions from our listeners, I'd be quite keen to hear them and publish those, because I'm sure there's some goodies out there about what he's thinking about.
Yeah, I just wonder whether he's considering just slaying it into the face of the nearest opposing player, and he's thinking, could I get away with it? What's the score here? And you go, oh no, maybe if we're up by 50, I'll do it.
Absolutely. Tilani Su, very, very good for the Chiefs. He was a very, very unfancied name. He's someone I've got again on the waiver wire. He's less than 1% owned, I believe it is, and he's someone that I think owners, if they're looking for, they weren't particularly happy with their loose forward, and maybe it's a Liam Squire or something like that as well, and they've picked up an injury. He's someone that you can look at in your league as well.
So Havili and Makalai, both. Well, actually, the highest scoring outside backs other than DMAC in this game. So clearly, you're taking them over Nadolo the rest of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. Nadolo's a has-been.
Just one of those games from Lowe, Nadolo, all those guys that we like.
Yeah, absolutely. Not worried about it at all. I think once Crotty comes back and that back line gets a little bit more parity and a little bit more punch, and Mwanga has another game under his belt, I think it'll be fine. They'll figure out a way to get Ndolo involved. And James Lowe had a decent game. He just doesn't translate into fantasy rugby draft points.
And so Tamanavalo obviously getting the start ahead of SBW. What did you think of it? Like what you saw?
Yes. Most of it came in a try and a break that he made. But I guess, you could say that about a lot of players, right? If he didn't do this or this, he wouldn't have scored very well. It's like, well, he did, and he did do that, and he did score quite well. So, fitted in quite well. I will say Anton Leonard-Brown coming on looked really, really good as well. We've been pumping him for a while.
He did.
And, he comes from good pedigree, good schoolage. So, we like to see that coming out. I guess I said it at you asked me on Thursday's podcast, Havili versus Stevenson. It was quite amusing that Stevenson was actually the player that ripped the ball out of Havili's hand and scored the try to win that battle. And I think Stevenson probably would have gone on to score more points against Havili had he not gone off injured. And what looks to be a fairly lengthy injury. We haven't heard much of it yet, but a bit of a buzzkill there.
So, to where occur Barlos, it could be looking at a suspension here. Brad Weber, like somebody to possibly look at picking up?
Yep, he looked really good. Really, really good. Just exactly the same as he did last season. He's got a good pass on him, directs around very well, and does some good sniping, and he's got some good top-end speed as well. Be interesting to see what happens with that TKB, because live, I thought it was pretty rough. I thought it was pretty bad, and I thought it was deliberate. I watched it in replay again, and tried to take off my eye patch, and it did cop him. I'm not sure I could say it was 100% deliberate to be a sighting. I think there might have been a little bit of something in there, but I don't think on any video evidence that he could possibly be cited for that.
Okay.
And I guess just to put a cap on this, it frustrated me a little bit that the Crusaders weren't allowed to bring on a reserve loose forward when Reid Prinsloo went down. And I guess this is something Sanzar does need to look at, because if we're all big on concussion and doing these protocols and getting the right players and making sure that the ownership is on the players to get off the field and identifying, fellow players that have been hit in the head, if the Crusaders aren't allowed to bring on a player, then what's the incentive, an extra player to replace Reid Prinsloo? Then what's the incentive to actually own up to being concussed? I think it's a really, really bad precedent. I think they've gotten that one wrong in the way that the rules have set, and I think it needs to change.
Fair enough. So, just purely from a fantasy point of view, anything more from this game?
No, if Cody Taylor plays at fullback, I think that's pretty good for the Crusaders. He was back there a couple of times, so I think that's pretty good for the front row. But the scrum was dominant. It didn't really translate too much into fantasy rugby draft points, so I think take what that with you.
That's actually an interesting point, though, because if a player that is listed in the front row for a team was by some miracle to actually get picked in a different position, presumably the points that he'd score there would still count towards the front row?
Correct.
Interesting.
No, it is, absolutely.
So if we ever get perhaps, like a goal-kicking hooker who gets shifted back to fullback, wow, could be in business there.
We talked about under-13s previously. We had one of those for the Require under-13s.
Nice.
It turned out he ate a bit too many pies and couldn't kick goals very well. But yeah, that's probably all I have from a fantasy perspective.
Great. So Waratahs Reds. Reds, same old story?
Yeah, it was. I will say that I read a lot of reports saying that the Waratahs thumped them and this and that. And they got up on them really quickly, and it looked like pretty bad news for the Reds. But there's a bit of heart there. They did come back, and they did, in that second half, they had every reason to crumble like a pack of cards. But they actually did. They played quite well, and they got a try, and they got quite a bit of momentum going. And it was only that they scored the Jake McIntyre's try, and it was only because they came back. The Waratahs scored a try immediately that they lost all of the momentum, and that was where the Waratahs won the game. But I think there's a few concerns from a fantasy perspective for the Reds. Main concern was not necessarily from a points for each of the individual players, but from a Jake McIntyre at fly half, just looked a little deep. He didn't look. There's a lot of passes that went to Karevi's shoulder, a lot of passes that went to Carmichael Hunt's shoulder and behind him, and just didn't get a really good momentum going. Now, I will say that he did actually come back in the second half and play quite well, but yeah, a few concerns there for the Reds. Good to see Goromaru got on quite early, and that was mainly because of Henry Taufa, and I'm pretty sure I've butchered that as well, but the second five, and so Carmichael Hunt came in and Goromaru came at fullback.
So, looking at the fantasy scorers this week, the Reds are noticeably absent, I guess, which is not too surprising, but the two names that are high up, one is Nick Frisby and the other one is Hendrik Tui. Any interest in those two?
Tui, I could take it or leave it. I think you could probably pick him up on Thursday or Friday. Nick Frisby, yes. And I've got a bit of a note here. Do we need to rethink halfbacks? And I wrote that at the start of, after about 2 or 3 games. And I've answered my own question as no. There's still a bit of an enigma. And you have to get the right player in the right position. And even then, sometimes it doesn't necessarily translate. But Nick Frisby, yes. I think it looks like he's going to take a lot more ownership to direct that team. Over Jake McIntyre. He's got young players outside him. He looked really good. He was a lot of darting, a lot of sniping. He got an assist for Jake's try, I believe it was, which helped him out as well. But no, I think there are a lot of players, a lot of managers out there that have the likes of Nick Serzaka, the likes of LB Mathewson, these types of players. And I would take Frisby over him, and I would take Bryn Hall as well in there as well. I would use a waiver wire pick-up on him, because there's only a handful of halfbacks, Kubeli, Perinara, and Reinach, that I really want to look at owning, and people are actually owned. So these are ones you can pick up on the waiver wire.
Mm-hmm. So Karevi we've spoken about already. We're not worried about him. Goromaru, how did you think he went generally?
It was really difficult. He didn't get into the game a hell of a lot. He chimed into the backline a couple of times. Didn't really make any breaks. And when the ball was kicked down to him, which wasn't all that often, he never really ran it back. He opted for territory, which was quite wise. I just want to, on Samu Karevi, I'm not concerned. There's nothing you can do about it. I'm not wholly concerned, I guess I probably should say. I'm a little bit concerned. But I think Jack McIntyre will get better and he'll grow into that role. And I think better things to come are to come. And the Waratahs are a good team. I mean, we talked about it at the top with the Brumbies and the Waratahs probably coming through from the Australian Conference. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think we've mentioned all the names. Just one that purely from a guy who looks like he has all the physical tools to be something, I guess, in this league. Nabuli. Looks like a bit of a beast. Obviously didn't get any opportunities here, but yeah, it could be interesting at some point this season, I think. Perhaps one to watch.
Yeah, so he's quite lowly owned as well. I think he is a one to watch. So he's less than 12% owned and less than 5% started. So I agree. Yep. He's a big lad, isn't he? And he sure looked like he should go well. And I think his output was probably more symptomatic of the Reds in general. Yeah, one to keep. I would say one to put on your watch list.
And from the Waratahs' perspective, kind of business as usual for them. Putting up points. We sort of expect them to. I guess Beale was the standout in a lot of ways. A lot of people will be happy with Carrara. I think he was someone that you pumped as someone you could stick into your lineup. We talked about Guildford and
pat on the back for you. That's a good call.
Yep. And Hooper, I guess, just being Hooper, scoring points. So, what did you make of the Waratahs?
Yeah, so it's a good call on Guildford. He looked pretty good in the end of that back line. Carraro as well. He got a little bit lucky for his try, but fair play. It was either Guildford's or his as well. Holloway is someone that we pulled out. He's one of those weird situations where he's playing at 8 and he's listed as a lock in fantasy rugby draft. And if he's not the number one waiver wire pick after Wednesday, I'll be really interested to look at the stats and see what happens. Then for me, I guess probably Blake Gibson is a bigger name, but I think Holloway, I would put him as my number one. What about you? Just because he separates out a lot of locks, he's that much better than a lot of other of the locks in terms of just repeatable performances, getting those meters.
Yep, no, I totally agree with that. I think given there's a sort of a dearth of locks who can actually put consistent output out there, I think he's a really good option.
So Michael Hooper, interestingly enough, so if you look at his fantasy rugby draft points, he was the top tackler in the weekend, which I thought was an interesting stat. I didn't really see that coming. If you watch the game, a lot of what the Waratahs did was based around him in that backline, deliberately creating backline moves around Michael Hooper, which is what they did last year and it's what they've done previously as well. I guess it's no surprise because Gibbo's was the back coach for a number of years there.
That's right. So if you were drafting again now, Hooper, the number 4 loose forward?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
No, absolutely.
Yep, I agree. Anything more from Waratahs Reds?
No, interesting to see Will Skelton playing at fly half for 99% of the game. They play that, okay, you tackle him first, and that's your biggest problem, and then we'll set a backline off it.
Yeah, literally the biggest problem. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, Force Rebels, did you manage to stay awake through this one?
So as I said, it was the fourth of my double header, my quadruple header, sorry. And I had this one on Sky Go in bed at about 12:30 at night. And I woke up with my iPhone on my forehead. So, I got through about to half time. From a fantasy perspective for this, the disappointing side of it was that Jack Debrashini and Nick Serzaka were pulled from the lineup. And I guess more importantly is that had a knock-on effect is Mike Harris. I suspect if Debrashini had been playing, that Harris wouldn't have played as well. He was heavily bandaged on that quad. Now, if you remember back last season, he had that same quad injury, and that plagued him quite a lot. He got corked on it against the Waratahs game quite early on, and he just didn't really recover. So I've got real concerns over him.
So I guess the beneficiary of those injuries was Reece Hodge, the output in terms of points was amazing. But from what you saw, does the player match the points?
I guess yes. It's not necessarily a player, but the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So congratulations to the less than 1% or almost 0.5% of people that started him. He's only owned in 2% of leagues. And you asked me, does the player match the points? I would say probably not, but it doesn't really matter in this point. I think he should be owned in all leagues. I think there is a lot of question marks around Harris and his kicking, and even going in, it was whether it was going to be Debrashini or Harris kicking goals. But if Harris is out for any time, or if he comes into that 12, and Hodge actually is an outside back that could kick, I think even if he's just on someone's bench, having the upside of potentially having a goal kicking fullback is value enough to roster him.
Okay, so you are buying this to a certain extent.
I'm buying it not necessarily in a repeatable, but I'm buying it from he needs to be owned.
Sure.
Because there are a lot of fluid movements in that Rebels team, and you talked about it at the top. It's not a repeatable. You can't go on tries. He scored that try. He played really well. Got the break. I wouldn't bank on that, but just on the pure opportunity, then yes.
Yep, obviously. And from the force side of things, John O'Lance, I guess this is not such a big surprise because I think it's someone that you in particular had pumped quite a lot in the pre-season. So what did he look like in terms of the eye test?
Yeah, he looked good. He looked well. He ran that backline quite well. The Force probably should have won this game. They had the wood on them at scrum and set pieces, but and maybe this is a little knock on John O'Lance, is that they couldn't quite convert that into something. But just from a fantasy rugby draft, he looked pretty good. Knocked over his goals. He looks like he wants to challenge the line a little bit more. He's someone that's owned in only 15% of leagues, so I expect a lot of waiver wire claims for him on Tuesday night.
So Haylett Petty, not probably a lot to say. We like him and we saw why.
Luke Morahan is someone that I was disappointed in. I am as my third outside back in a couple of leagues, and he didn't particularly go well. I think I'm not going to knee-jerk and get rid of him, but I would seriously consider starting someone over him next week. We'll try and pull a little bit out on Thursday, but I don't think he's an automatic start, which I certainly thought he was in that third outside back position.
Sure. And I guess the other player that people are interested in from this game didn't play. Naivalu. What's the latest with him?
Yeah, so that's a bit of a shocker. So I hear that someone, I can't remember who it was, and I apologise for the listener out there, but someone got in touch with us to say that he's out for quote unquote several weeks. So quite what that means. And if you remember, he broke his leg at the end of, was it Super Rugby? I think it might have been the end of Super Rugby last year. I don't think it was the NRC. So I think it's taking a little bit of time to get back. And obviously he didn't go to Naholo's witch doctor in Fiji to get that sorted. There's a lesson to be learnt there for kids out there.
Okay. Anything more from this game? Tamani Allison, he's startable?
He is, yeah. We talked about that last year. He's a bit unlikely. It was a good break and set up Reece Hodge's try. I think he's another player that around about that Tay Walden, Safontaine kind of area, Mitch Inman type range. I think he'll be all right. Yep. Okay,
good. So just moving on to Sharks Kings, I think one of the question marks we had was around the starting fly half for the Sharks, and Coach Gary Gold opting for Joe Peterson in the 10 jersey, and how did he go?
I guess first let's go back to his selection. I think there was a few rumours that were being seeded in the media in South Africa that Garth April was going to start at 10. I didn't believe that for a second, but there was a lot of people that were kind of wondering about Joe Pye's output as well as rostering Gareth April. But team sheets came out, Joe Pye starting. I guess he played well. I guess a bit of it's to do with the Kings. He went to fullback, interestingly enough, when Willie LaRue went off after about, I think it might have been half an hour to go. So there is that upside also with Joe Peterson, is that he can get you that few metres to stay at fullback, because Garth April came on and played at 10 as well. But overall, looking at, say, the Mwanga, Robert Dupree, Joe Peterson, John O'Lance level, it's Mwanga and Joe Pai 1 and 2 anyway in that tier.
Okay. A guy we talked about quite a lot in pre-season, Willie LaRue, came through in terms of points. Is this a sign of things to come?
It looked like it, mate. Yeah, it did. He looked really good. He looked like the Willie LaRue we expect, right? When he glides and does that little skip step and he gets involved and, he put on the afterburners for his try. It looked really good. Again, bit of an asterisk around playing against the Kings, but you can only play what was in front of you, and he looked really, 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 really good. I think that was a good call from yourself in the off season. I was a bit hesitant to pull the trigger, but from what I've seen, he looks fit. They're managing his minutes. Obviously, as the Kings, they had the game won, so he came off, but I think good things to come.
Sure. And we talked about the Kings, and we sort of said we'll wait and see what comes out of this game. Anything come out of this game?
We did say that, didn't we?
We did.
I said someone would invariably rise from the ashes for the Kings. Well, it turns out I was wrong.
We had ashes rising from ashes.
We had ashes. Elgar Watts is probably the player we were looking at, and maybe Jurgen Visser, but neither really put up a performance that I want to advocate as putting a claim in for on the waiver wire. I think if you're in a push on Friday, if something goes against your way during the week in terms of team naming, maybe, but he'll be available in your league, or actually you could probably do even better, to be honest. So not really, no.
And I guess possibly you're fancying teams playing against the Kings as well.
Yes, that's absolutely true. So if you looked at the Dupree brothers, it seems that somehow they've gotten bigger. They played Jean-Luc and Daniel, I believe it's Daniel, really, really good. And that was their first proper kind of run out starting for the Sharks. And they're big boys, and they've got some really silky touches. They're going to be a force for a long time coming, I think, in not only Sharks football, but South Africa football as well. In terms of fantasy, Jean-Luc scored the try, so didn't really translate. I guess you could do worse than the output they produced, but just from an eye test, they looked like really quality players.
Okay. So anybody else from this game? I'm guessing whoever it is, it won't be a King.
No, I wanted to make a point of Paul Jordan. Much like we talked about Francois Venter, not a fancied name, but someone who we've always liked, is he produces you that fantasy rugby draft output. So again, you're probably not going to get much from a trade from him because he doesn't have that name attached to him. But if you wanted him for your second midfielder, you're laughing.
Okay. So just moving on to Stormers Bulls. So just purely looking through the fantasy points, you would assume the Bulls actually did not turn up to this game. Perhaps the bus broke down on the way there?
It was funny watching the game actually, because my Sky failed for all of the 4 games, and I had to watch them on catch up a little bit later on Sunday. And so I only read the reports around how good the Stormers were and how terrible the Bulls looked. And up to about 60 minutes, there was still only 3 points in it. I was like, well, this is an interesting turn of events. How have they done that? But it was a matter of, the Stormers had a lot of the play and the Bulls were just hanging on. And to be honest, the most concerning thing about the Bulls, and it is only one game, is that it just didn't really look like they had much direction. They looked like they were a little bit in two minds whether they wanted to be this tough, marauding, scrummaging, mauling team, or whether they wanted to just fling it out to Jesse Creel to do something. And they didn't really look like they had a solid plan.
So I know a person in one of my leagues who picked up Robert Dupree in the second round. Is he a genius?
Wow, that's high. The answer to that is probably no, if he's one of your mates.
You're correct, he actually isn't a genius, I can assure you of that.
But no, it's a good shout. He looked good. Young guy, fairly good directing him around the paddock. There's a few aimless kicks and a couple of times, but I think he knew that the Bulls weren't offering a hell of a lot in terms of attack and counter-attack, which was a bit surprising from Warwick Hallant. But no, very, very well played. Took his try well. I think obviously second round's a little bit ambitious, but certainly from where you are now, if he's in your team, good things.
And I think, once again, for us to pat ourselves on the back a little bit, just in terms of strategy, he was another fly half, wasn't he, in that Richie Mo'unga, Ihaya West kind of range where we thought, wait, get them late and maybe more than one of them, and you can't go wrong. And so far that's panning out.
Absolutely. So it's game week 1. Let's not try and overreact on that and pat us on the back too much.
Yeah.
But you're correct. So far that looks like a strategy that appears to be working. And it was across the board as well on the guys that we're looking at. John O'Lance as well as another player on that tier that, you could get quite late and you bundle them up. And I know a lot of folks who listen to the podcast have actually done that. So you probably did okay week 1.
So another big name player out of this game, Jesse Creel, playing at centre. We wondered how that would affect his game. Did it affect his game?
I am a little bit concerned with Jesse Creel. He looks like it looks like he's the when you're in under 13s, going back to Rakaia under 13s, you've got that one star in your team, and it's just everybody get the ball to him. It looked a little bit like that, and they never really helped him out and setting him up and trying to do anything constructive, earn the right to go forward before giving Jesse a bit of space. And he just never really had that space. And maybe that was smart on the Stormers' behalf as well, as they identified that as being the one key difference or the key spark for the Bills. And I just wonder, I'm concerned as output versus outside back to start with. And then secondly, I'm concerned with that back line that Francois Brummer has settled. And I'll be really interested to see what the coach does coming into the Friday team sheet.
Right. So, I guess too early to think about trades maybe, but if you were, would you think of perhaps a Willie LaRue over Jesse Creel?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I would. And I think, could you get that? I think you probably could.
I think
both names.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I think you could. And I think, especially if you're a South African fan and perhaps you're trading with a Bulls fan, or vice versa, it might be something that somebody might just do at this stage of the season, just being
play on the heartstrings a little bit.
Yeah, being a sort of a bit patriotic to their team. So it might be something that you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, your pizza's done, and then Jesse Creel, I think. Obviously, you're selling low on him. It's a terrible output, and you don't really want to do that after game week 1. But it's not a bad option. If you can get Willie LaRue for him, I'll probably do it. It's just whether the Willie LaRue owner is willing to take that.
Sure.
Or listens to the podcast.
Yeah. So probably not a lot of other takeaways from this. I guess a guy that was highly touted coming in as a sleeper, but going higher than a sleeper. You touched on him already, Gallant. Did you see anything?
Not as much as the Curry Cup. He had plenty of opportunities, but, we were expecting the YouTube reel, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Did we see the alternative YouTube reel?
we may have seen the scouting.
The offcuts from that YouTube.
That's right. The cutting room floor.
Yeah,
indeed.
Exactly. So not the new Cheslin Colby, or just too early to say?
It's too early to say, mate. Look, the Stormers are really, really good. They played a smart game, and that's a really good team. So I don't want to overreact. We just talked about overreacting with Jesse Creel, but I want to give it a little bit of time with Hallant. Just on Colby, I think he's still playing sevens. There was a lot of chip kicks that he tried to do, and he tried to chip kick Giannis Kirsten at some point, which off his left, I might add, which is, I don't know. Small man trying to get over big man, it just wasn't possible. So I think he'll get a little bit of a talking to from Robbie Fleck, just to say, put that back in the holster and do what you do well. But,
I actually made a trade for somebody who was lacking a 10, and I had Robert Dupree on the bench leading into this week, and I put a trade offer out there to give Dupree away and get Colby back, and kind of just forgot about it, and I woke up in the middle of the night realizing I hadn't cancelled that trade, and I rushed out and I cancelled it immediately. Yeah, because I think Dupree's got some value.
Yeah, he does. Well, two things to that. I guess first of all, you don't want your trade to go through 2 minutes before 7 o'clock on Friday, and he goes straight to your bench. That's the worst case scenario. But just as a point, if you did execute a trade and you had one out there and it was after the lock, the trade doesn't actually go through and isn't reflected in your starting lineup if you traded out that player until after the waiver wire on Tuesday. So it's only if it's really close to 7 o'clock, or we did see a lot of trades go through that time, and we hope that players have realised that they go straight to your bench and not into your starting lineup. But that's a fair call, Robert Dupree for Chelsea and Colby. I think there are a lot of fly halves out there.
Sure, yeah. It depends on your needs, I guess. I just felt at the time, given that he was my backup, that it just seemed like someone I wouldn't mind hanging on to at the time. Because I've got other outside backs, and yeah, I think, we'll see. I mean, it may come out the other way, but that's fine. So, anything else from this game?
Probably not necessary from a fantasy rugby draft perspective. I think Intervini's try on the 77th minute will be one that the Stormers fans will remember of for a long, long time. They bullied that Bulls forward pack and marched them back underneath their posts. It was an incredible maul. It was just they'll remember that for a while.
Sure. So just as an overall across this week, is this amongst the highest scoring weeks that you can remember? I'm sure it'd be the highest scoring week one. It seemed like a crazy week.
Yeah, there was a lot of... yes, I think, ultimately looking at players and points scored. How many of those players were in starting lineups? I will have a little bit of an asterisk. I think a lot of players that scored well might not necessarily... They'll be owned a lot of points, but not necessarily started.
Sure.
But yeah, there's some big scores put out there. I think if you have a look at our top score for the week, it was 225. And it's actually a bit of a nice segue. So the top manager was Tom Holloway, and he was in the league Shooter McGavin in terms of the individual score of 225.7. However, his league Shooter McGavin wasn't particularly strong, so our overall manager was actually Carrick Massey with 194 points. So, and he was in the fifth strongest league. The strongest league was the Shiva Bowl. Number 2 was Cominetas, and I apologise for those in Afrikaans there who understand what that means. I don't. And the third one was Justin's World. So those are the three strongest leagues. The strongest, as I said, overall manager was Carrick Massey, and then Andrew Howard and Dilla Jacobson were rounding out the top three. So,
I suppose at this point I should actually just mention that it was Andrew Howard that actually beat me in one particular league. So I've kind of consoled myself with the fact that it took a top 5 performance to take me down.
Indeed.
But,
No, it was a good performance.
Yeah,
Gameweek 1.
It sure was. I mean, just anecdotally, like I saw a few occasions where 120 plus points wasn't enough to win, and that's pretty rare.
It is. I got away. I got lucky in a couple of my leagues. I scored a $1.09 or something like that, $1.10, and managed to win. But yeah, there's some big scores that got beaten.
Yeah.
Which is the good thing and the bad thing about this format.
It is. Yeah.
It drives you insane.
That's right. Yeah. So moving forward into week 2, looking at waiver wire picks, we've mentioned there was a lot of scores, very high scores by some fairly unfancied players. I guess the question on a lot of people's lips will be, who's the number 1 waiver wire pick? And I know that's a difficult question because it depends on your needs, but I guess in a vacuum, which unfancied player, I guess, do you think is the most repeatable, that's going to have the most value moving forward?
So if you used ownership percentage as a yardstick, John Alliance is only owned in 15% of leagues.
Right.
I think purely on that calculation, I would have him as number 1.
I think we probably just have a feeling that what John Alliance is doing is more repeatable than perhaps Fred Zillinger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. Nick Frisby, we talked about him as well.
Mm-hmm.
He's only owned in 9% of leagues, and Jed Holloway is only owned in 6%. And we talked a little bit about Reece Hodge at 2%. I think those guys are probably in some variation, and it goes, as you said, it's very much dependent on what your need is. But I've got a list of about 10 here with Bryn Hall, Tuchelet's only 34% owned, Tay Walden's 20% owned, Yanis Kirsten, another player that's playing at lock, on flanker, loose forward, and is listed as a lock. He's owned in less than 2%, and I think he's another one. If you don't get Jed Holloway, another one that you can put in that lock and get good loose forward statistics for. Giratale, we talked about. Talani Su from the Chiefs. And I've got a little bit of a smoky here. If any of the Stormers' outside backs gets injured, Zeeland Zas. He looks like lightning in a bottle. Stormers' wing that came on. We saw a little bit of buzz of him pre-season and a little bit of buzz last year. But if any of those outside backs, Cobus van Wyk and Dylan Lates, or any of those guys get injured, just a player to keep an eye on.
So I guess the Lions front row would be sort of advising people to perhaps cool their jets a little bit on that, though, given that it was the matchup.
Yeah, don't expect too much. Don't expect the same output, but I was really, really impressed with the Marks and Smith coming off the bench. They were very, very strong. Now, again, that probably has a lot to do with the Sunwolves more than anything else, but looked pretty good.
Yeah. So I guess for me, given that most people probably have a reasonable fly half and probably have a fairly handy backup, I do like John O'Lance, but I think Reece Hodges probably the number one pickup for me just because he's something a little bit different, right?
That's fair.
Yeah.
No, that's fair.
And I think John O'Lance probably at 2, and I guess Frisbee at 3, because he's probably just offering something once again that's a little bit different from perhaps other halfbacks, whereas with Zelinga, I just get the feeling that on a week-to-week basis he's probably just going to come back to the mean and just be just another guy.
So Frisbee versus Bryn Hall, if you had the option in your league and looking at the statistics, Bryn Hall is only owned in 39% of leagues, Frisbee only in 9%. Which would you have as your waiver priority? I'm
kind of leaning towards Hall.
Yeah, so am I.
Mainly around the team that he plays for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you listen to this podcast again, I think everything pointed to what I was saying was Nick Frisbee, but I've just seen that Hall is actually part of that, potentially picked up and not owned in league, so I would have him over Frisbee. But it's kind of close, and I think that is the deciding factor.
Sure. And I guess with because generally you wouldn't expect people to have a halfback on the bench. So where are you ranking Bryn Hall, I guess? I mean, I know it's a tough question because it's off the top of your head, but do you like him more than, say, Andy Ellis?
Yes.
You do?
Yep. Probably more than the Chiefs halfbacks.
Okay.
More than Aaron Smith.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. He looked really, really good.
Right.
And it was ball carrying as well.
Sure.
He made a lot of darts and he set up like Gibson's try. I was very, very impressed, and maybe I've gone too far, but I think,
okay.
I don't know. Aaron Smith can be a bit hit and miss sometimes. We talked about TKB and his output and maybe Brad Weber coming in, but yeah.
So I guess that probably puts him in sort of the second half of the top 10 somewhere. There'd be Reineck, TJ, Landajo, probably missing somebody here, but I'd imagine there's probably a top 5, and then maybe he's just outside that?
Yep. Say so.
Yep.
I think that's probably about the right.
Okay.
Yep. Just a quick note. So I've just seen a tweet from a friend of the podcast, Justin Pivus, and he's pulled out an article from Australian media saying that Aidan Toa was solid at fullback in his comeback to Australian rugby. Maybe I don't know anything, but he just looked very shaky.
Maybe as opposed to liquid, he was actually a solid. You can't argue with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the last thing I wanted to point was more of an administration point of view. So to those new and starting fantasy rugby draft is that you can actually play and set up a league now in draft. So midweek, what it does is that every game week that you miss, it just drops off one of your fixtures. So regular season, if you started before the start of the Super Rugby season, you had 14 matchups to play till you got to the playoffs. So now if you start a league today, you'll only have 13 matchups. So it's not like the salary cap version where you're out of it, you can't play if you haven't scored those points from first week. It's pretty much the same experience that you're going to get for the rest of them. And for those that are really new to the product, the Waiver Wire, so that runs on Tuesday night, 8 p.m. New Zealand time. And the Waiver Wire is a way that we allocate players fairly to teams. So all of the unowned players go on waivers at the Gameweek lock on a Friday, and anyone can put a request in. And we talked about all the guys that you potentially want to put a request in. But say let's say you want to put a request in for Reece Hodge, and there's 4 players in your league that want to pick up Reece Hodge. The Waiver Wire is a way of calculating which team Reece Hodge gets assigned to, and that's either based on the inverse of your league rankings, or it's the reverse of your draft order, whatever your commissioner set it up at the start of the season. A little bit of admin. You can follow us on Twitter at Fantasy Rug Draft. That's Fantasy OEG Draft. And Mossman, what's your handle, mate? We don't usually put that out, but I thought I'd put it out there. You're offering a few sound bites on Twitter these days.
That's a really good question.
I'm pretty sure it's at Nathan Mossman. And again, if you could keep on doing us a favour and add us as a contact in your email, you'll be doing God's work. Basically, we need to get a lot of those notifications into people's inboxes so they see the trade requests, they be able to scout, whose player's been dropped, who's been added, that type of thing, and not necessarily being able to log in. All of those things would be great if you could do. That's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for downloading and listening. I'm Bruce Hawkinson. He's Nathan Mossman.
Smitty!
And in the words of the post-match interviewer in the Cheetahs-Jaguars game, you can go.
What a bust here by Christian Cullen. Plenty of support, and what a dummy!